Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to participate in this year's ISEE Degrowth 2025 conference, held under the inspiring title, Building a Socially Just Post-Growth Future, Linking Theory and Action. We are pleased to present our paper, Environmental Racism from the Perspective of the Global Climate Risk Index. This presentation was prepared by Antonín Hořčica and Eva Cudlínová from the Department of Regional Management at the University of South Bohemia in České Budějovice. Although we regret not being able to attend in person, we deeply appreciate the opportunity to share our work with this inspiring community, and we thank the organizers for making this global exchange of ideas possible. Let's begin by briefly framing the broader climate justice context that our paper addresses. In this presentation, we explore how climate change impacts disproportionately affect poorer countries, despite their minimal contribution to global emissions. This imbalance is closely linked to what we call environmental racism. We use data from the Global Climate Risk Index to analyze this injustice through the lens of vulnerability, responsibility, and adaptive capacity. The index was developed by Germanwatch, an independent NGO committed to global equity and sustainability. We focus on the most climate-vulnerable nations and the largest CO2 emitters. Our aim is to highlight the mismatch between who suffers and who pollutes, using measurable indicators like the Human Development Index and cumulative emissions. Climate change gained global attention in the 1970s, but real policy action began later. The 1992 Earth Summit led to the UN Climate Convention, followed by the Kyoto Protocol in 2005, the first binding deal to cut emissions. A major breakthrough came with the Paris Agreement in 2016, uniting countries to limit warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Since 1995, annual UN climate conferences have tracked progress and shaped global response. These milestones laid the groundwork for how we now understand and pursue climate justice. Climate change is a complex global issue with multiple dimensions. It requires environmental monitoring, legal agreements, economic tools, technological innovation, and ethical responsibility. One of the key challenges is ensuring that all people, especially the most vulnerable, are protected. While every country is affected, developing nations contribute the least to emissions and are the least equipped to respond. This brings us to the core of climate justice, making fairness and human rights central to climate policy. Climate justice means recognizing that not everyone is equally responsible for or equally affected by climate change. Wealthier countries have caused the most damage but often face fewer consequences. Structural inequalities, based on race, gender, or income, worsen the impacts, even within the same country. It's also a generational issue. Today's youth will bear the long-term effects. Climate justice calls for protecting the vulnerable and ensuring that no one is left behind in the global response. Climate colonialism shows how wealthy countries still profit from fossil fuel-driven growth, while poorer nations bear the environmental costs. This reflects deep-rooted global and social inequalities. The richest 10% produce about half of all emissions, while the poorest 50% emit only 10%. As sociologist Stefan Lesnich said, we live above the means of others. The Loss and Damage Fund, launched at COP28 in 2023 after decades of advocacy, supports countries hardest hit by climate change. It is based on the principle that wealthier nations should pay for their historic responsibility for emissions. The fund's basic operational need was $250 million, with a target of $100 billion per year by 2030 to meet global adaptation and recovery needs. To understand climate inequality, we work with 3 key indicators. First, the Human Development Index reflects each country's capacity to cope with climate impacts, based on life expectancy, education, and income. Second, cumulative CO2 emissions show who has contributed most to climate change, considering historical responsibility since 1750. Third, the Global Climate Risk Index measures long-term human and economic losses from extreme weather events. Together, these indicators illustrate the global inequality of climate change impacts and will guide our analysis in the next section. The Human Development Index is a widely used measure of progress in 3 dimensions: health, education, and income. In the context of climate change, it helps assess how well countries can cope with its impacts. Nations with lower HDI often lack adequate healthcare, education, and financial resources for adaptation or recovery. The index groups countries into 4 categories: very high HDI, like Iceland, Norway, Switzerland; high HDI, including Brazil, China, Iran, medium HDI, for example, India, Kenya, Guatemala, low HDI, such as Chad, Somalia, South Sudan. These categories highlight global disparities in resilience and vulnerability. Cumulative emissions show who has contributed most to global warming since 1750. Historically, the largest emitters are the United States and the European Union, especially Germany, France, Poland, and Italy. These emissions reflect the carbon cost of early industrialization and long-term fossil fuel use. This historical responsibility remains central to the discussion of climate justice and fair burden sharing today. Annual emissions highlight today's main polluters. China now leads globally, with India rising rapidly. This shift reflects modern industrialization trends and growing economies. While responsibility started in the West, today's emissions show that all major economies must be part of the solution. The Global Climate Risk Index measures how strongly countries are affected by extreme weather events, such as floods, storms, and heat waves. It combines data on human and economic losses to create a long-term ranking of vulnerability. The index was developed by the NGO Germanwatch and is based on 30 years of data, now primarily from the EMDAT disaster database. GCRI helps identify countries that are repeatedly hit hardest by climate-related disasters, regardless of their emissions. It does not reflect future risk, but it reveals how different countries have already been affected, making visible the unequal burden of climate impacts around the world. The GCRI combines three categories of impact: economic losses, fatalities, and the number of people affected. Each is measured both in absolute terms and relative to population size or GDP. This approach shows not only the scale of damage, but also how severely it affects smaller or poorer countries. The final index score is calculated as a weighted average of all 6 indicators, reflecting both intensity and vulnerability. The index focuses on 5 major climate threats: droughts, floods, heat waves, storms, and wildfires. These are assessed by their impact on fatalities, the number of people affected, and economic losses, both in 2022 and over the past 30 years. In 2022, extreme heat triggered wildfires and droughts across Europe, while Belize suffered severe flooding after a hurricane. Looking at fatalities, heat waves were the most deadly that year, causing over 61,000 deaths, mainly in southern Europe. Over the long term, however, storms have been the leading cause of death. When it comes to affected people, droughts dominated in 2022, while floods remain the biggest threat overall. And in terms of economic damage, storms caused the greatest losses, both in 2022 and across the full period. Here we can see the impact climate disasters have had on individual countries. In 2022, Pakistan was hit hardest, mainly due to devastating floods. Other countries high on the list include Belize, Italy, and Greece, which face severe storms and heat waves. Looking at the longer period from 1993 to 2022, the most affected countries include Dominica, China, and Honduras. India, Greece, and Spain appear in both rankings, showing repeated and long-term exposure. The map highlights global hotspots, especially in South and Southeast Asia, Central America and the Caribbean, parts of Africa, and also Southern Europe. In the next 3 slides, we explore how emissions, climate impacts, and human development are interconnected. This chart divides countries into 4 groups based on historical CO2 emissions and climate impacts, using the Global Climate Risk Index. Quadrant 1 includes low-emission, high-impact countries like Dominica, Haiti, Fiji, or Eswatini. They are innocent victims, least responsible, yet hardest hit. Quadrant 2 features high emitters also facing severe impacts, such as USA, China, or India. These are burdened polluters. Quadrant 3 includes low-emission, low-impact countries like Botswana, Barbados, Suriname, or the Maldives, the fortunate exceptions. And Quadrant 4 covers high emitters with low impacts, like the Japan, Canada, Poland, or Indonesia, shielded polluters, responsible but less affected. Building on the previous slide, we now look at how the Human Development Index is distributed across the same 4 emission impact groups. The differences are striking. In both Quadrant 1 and 10 above lower HDI levels, meaning less access to healthcare, education, and income, all of which are essential for preparing for and recovering from climate shocks. In contrast, countries in Quadrants 2 and 4, those with high emissions, show significantly higher HDI levels. They benefit not only from past economic growth, but also from stronger infrastructure and institutional support. This slide brings the previous insights together. The left graph shows that countries with low emissions are mostly in the medium and low HDI groups, marked in red, making up over 60%. In contrast, high-emission countries, especially those less affected, are largely in the high or very high HDI groups, shown in green. The right graph flips the view. Most high and very high HDI countries face low impacts, while medium and low HDI countries experience much higher impact. Once again, those who pollute less and suffer more also have the least capacity to adapt. Climate inequality clearly mirrors global development divides. Based on our analysis, we can say that the GCRI and HDI together reveal deep climate inequality. Major emitters, often with high HDI, face lower climate impacts but hold greater responsibility. In contrast, low-emission, low HDI countries suffer the most and are least able to adapt. High development often comes with higher emissions, showing a trade-off between progress and climate harm. Climate inequality highlights a global imbalance. Those most responsible are least affected, while the least responsible bear the greatest risks. In conclusion, we call for a response that focuses not just on managing the symptoms, but on real transformation, addressing the root causes of the climate crisis through systemic change. The continued rise in emissions, despite decades of global agreements, shows that the current economic model, built on growth, extraction, and inequality, is failing. Climate justice requires more than partial fixes or symbolic funds. It demands a shift in how we structure our economies, placing environmental boundaries and social equity at the center. Only then can we begin to solve the climate crisis in a just and lasting way. Here is an overview of the key references and data sources used in our analysis. Thank you for your attention and interest in our work. We hope this presentation has contributed to the ongoing conversation on climate justice and inequality. If you have any questions, comments, or would like to get in touch, please feel free to contact us via email.